On the day of my sister's wedding, I was supposed to be family. Instead, I was stripped of that right. My parents yanked me out of the gown I had chosen for the ceremony and shoved me into a server's uniform. From that moment forward, I wasn't a guest. I was the help. They had me scrubbing floors, carrying trays, and darting in and out of the kitchen like a hired maid. No smile, no thanks, just orders barked at me while my sister paraded through the hall like royalty. To everyone else, I was invisible, but I kept my head down, silent, waiting. And then it happened. I walked to the groom's table with a tray of wine, just another servant doing her job, or so they thought. But when the groom looked up at me, his hand trembled. The glass tipped, the wine spilled, and the entire hall gasped. His eyes widened, and with a voice that cracked the silence, he called me one word that shattered the illusion of their perfect wedding boss. In that single moment, every lie my family had told, every insult, every humiliation, they all came crashing down. You're about to hear how a woman cast aside as a maid brought an entire wedding and a lifetime of family deceit to its knees. And trust me, the twist that followed was darker, uglier, and more devastating than anyone expected. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just end with shock, it ends with revenge. Evelyn Harper was 38 years old, a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity and an air of restraint. By trade, she was in events, though no one in her family ever asked or cared enough to know what that meant. She lived alone in Manhattan, with a modest but carefully built life, one where she had carved out her own independence after years of being overlooked. To outsiders, she seemed composed, perhaps even a little reserved, but beneath the surface was a lifetime of slights and dismissals that had taught her how to stand still while the world underestimated her. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slid under her apartment door by the mailman who knew her by name. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, the tight cursive strokes she had seen on countless notes over the years. Her stomach tightened before she even opened it. She knew what it would contain. Her younger sister Linda was finally getting married, and of course there would be an invitation. Evelyn carried the envelope to the kitchen counter, set it down beside her coffee cup, and looked at it as if it were something poisonous. When she finally tore it open, she wasn't surprised, though the reality stung more than she wanted to admit. The card was elegant, embossed with gold lettering announcing the union of Linda Harper and Daniel Cole at a 5-star hotel in the Hamptons. The kind of wedding people whispered about, where every detail was designed to be envied. Evelyn's eyes scanned the details carefully, waiting to see her name listed among the guests. There was no mention. Her name was nowhere. Instead, tucked inside was a handwritten note from her mother. Evelyn, arrive early to help with preparations. We'll need an extra pair of hands. The words sank in with a weight she had felt before, heavier each time. An invitation not as a sister, not as family, but as labor. Not to celebrate, but to serve. It wasn't unexpected. Nothing her family did to diminish her really surprised her anymore, but it still cut deep. Evelyn pressed her lips together and folded the note back into the envelope. She had long ago perfected the art of hiding her reactions, of swallowing the hurt before anyone else could see it. Her mind drifted back, as it often did in moments like this, to the years when she was a child in that same household. Linda always received the better toys at Christmas, the prettier dresses for Easter, the larger slices of cake at birthday parties. Their parents didn't even try to disguise the favoritism. Linda was the golden child, the one they paraded before neighbors and relatives, while Evelyn was expected to be useful, quiet, and unremarkable. She could still hear her mother's voice when she was 10 years old, dismissing her excitement over a school award. "That's nice, dear, but your sister is performing in the recital. That's what people will really care about." As a teenager, Evelyn learned to stop asking for things. She wore Linda's hand-me-downs even when they didn't fit quite right, and endured the sidelong looks from classmates. When relatives came to visit, Linda was praised for her charm and beauty, while Evelyn was introduced almost apologetically, as if her existence required explanation. "Evelyn's here too," her father would say. "She's helpful around the house." The words still rang in her ears. Helpful. That was all she had ever been allowed to be. Now, at 38, receiving this so-called invitation, she saw the pattern for what it was. Nothing had changed. In their eyes, she was still the spare, the one to lean on when there was work to be done, but never the one to celebrate or to honor. She turned the envelope over in her hands again, noticing how even the handwriting on the note carried a tone of command. "We'll need an extra pair of hands." It wasn't even a request. It was an order delivered with the assumption that she had no life of her own, nothing more important than bending to their needs. She set the envelope aside and moved to the window of her apartment, looking out over the city. Manhattan stretched before her, noisy and alive, a place she had fought hard to call her own. She should have felt insulated from their disdain by now, secure in the life she had built apart from them. But the note gnawed at her reopening wounds she thought had scarred over. She was not angry in the way she might have been years ago. The anger had cooled into something sharper, more controlled. But the pain, the dull ache of being unseen and unwanted, that was still there. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague reminding her of a meeting scheduled for the following day. She typed a quick reply confirming she would be there, but her mind was elsewhere. The Hamptons, the hotel, her sister's wedding, and her role once again reduced to that of a servant. She wondered if her colleagues, people who respected her for her quiet efficiency and reliability, would even believe her if she told them how her family treated her. She doubted it. They saw her as steady, capable someone who always seemed in control. They didn't know how much of that had been forged in the crucible of being constantly undervalued. As she stood there, she thought of Linda, always Linda. Beautiful, ambitious, adored. Linda had never gone without admiration or support. Their parents had invested in her education, her career, her every whim, while Evelyn had been left to find scraps of encouragement wherever she could. Even now, the wedding was another performance of Linda's perfect life, staged at great expense with Evelyn relegated to the shadows. The note might have been brief, but it carried the weight of decades. It was as if her parents had distilled every slight, every dismissal into a single line: "Arrive early to help with preparations." Evelyn closed her eyes and let out a breath. The temptation to tear the card in half, to throw it in the trash and never look back, was strong. But she knew she would go. She always went. For reasons she barely understood herself, some mixture of duty and hope that things might someday change, she would be there. She returned to the counter, picked up the card again, and placed it back in its envelope. She would go, but not as they expected. She would not show her anger, not yet. She would wear the mask she had perfected over years of practice. Calm, obliging, invisible. Inside, though, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Not anger, not sadness, but anticipation. For once, she would not simply endure. The city outside hummed on, oblivious to the storm that was beginning to gather inside Evelyn Harper. She placed the envelope in her drawer and straightened her shoulders. Family duty, she told herself. That was the reason she would go. But in truth, there was another reason she didn't yet dare to name. Something was coming, and she would be ready when it did. Evelyn arrived at the hotel on the morning of the wedding, the envelope with its stinging note still tucked away in her bag. The Hamptons' air was crisp, filled with the smell of salt from the ocean, but for her there was no freshness in it. The hotel gleamed like something out of a magazine, its marble floors shining staff hurrying about in pressed uniforms, flowers arriving by the truckload. She should have felt like a guest entering a grand celebration. Instead, she felt like a shadow walking into someone else's dream. Her mother was waiting in the lobby, standing stiffly, as though the very air around her were meant to serve as a throne. She took one look at Evelyn, dressed in the modest navy dress she had chosen carefully for the occasion, and her lips curved in disdain. "That won't do," Margaret Harper said flatly, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Upstairs. Change out of that. You're not sitting with the guests." Evelyn's pulse quickened, though her face remained calm. "I brought the dress you asked me to wear." "Mother," she answered quietly, though she already knew it was pointless. Margaret gestured to a garment bag hanging on her arm. "This is what you'll be wearing. There are enough important people here today." I won't have you embarrassing us. Khan doesn't belong at the table with executives and partners. You'll do better helping where you're needed." Evelyn unzipped the bag and her stomach twisted. Inside was a crisp, black uniform, the same style she had noticed on the hotel's catering staff when she walked in. The implication was unmistakable. She wasn't to be part of the family, not even as a background presence. She was to be staff. Mother Evelyn began, but Margaret cut her off, her tone absolute. "Do not argue with me, Evelyn. You know as well as I do your sister's big day must be flawless. Guests are flying in from Europe, investors, people who matter. Do you understand, people who matter? This family cannot afford your presence at the table. Change your clothes and get to work." The words landed heavy, but what stung most was the casual certainty with which they were delivered. Not cruelty laced with passion, but cruelty practiced until it became second nature. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, the familiar ache of being deemed less than invisible unless she was useful. Her hands gripped the fabric of the dress she had brought with her, then loosened. She reminded herself of the mask she had promised to wear. Calm, silent, invisible. Upstairs in a small changing room, Evelyn removed the dress she had bought with her own savings fabric that had once felt elegant and proud, and folded it with care, as though it still deserved dignity. She slipped into the uniform, stiff and ill-fitting, a costume that declared her role not as sister, but as servant. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman reflected back was no longer a guest at a wedding, no longer family. She was background. When she walked back into the lobby, carrying herself with as much composure as she could, her mother gave a satisfied nod, the kind one might give to a well-trained worker. "Now you look appropriate," Margaret said briskly. "The guests won't ask questions." But they did. As Evelyn moved quietly through the halls, carrying trays of glasses, adjusting table linens, her relatives and acquaintances caught sight of her. Some gave puzzled looks. Others whispered behind their hands. One older cousin she hadn't seen in years glanced at her with pity, as though she had fallen so low that pity was all she deserved. Another distant aunt actually asked, "Have you been working here long?" Evelyn smiled faintly as though the question had no power to hurt, and moved on without answering. Inside, though, something was twisting tight, coiling like a spring. Every glance, every whisper added to the weight pressing against her chest. She could feel her cheeks grow warm, not from shame, but from the effort of containing the storm that wanted to rise. She had told herself she would endure, but endurance was beginning to feel like a prison. At one point, as she cleared away a tray, she caught sight of her father across the room speaking with a group of guests. She waited, hoping for a flicker of recognition, perhaps a signal that he saw her and would step in. Instead, he barely looked at her. His eyes passed over her as though she were invisible, exactly as he had always treated her. The memory struck her without warning, his voice from years ago echoing in her mind. She had been no older than 15, carrying groceries in from the car, trying to earn a scrap of praise. He had chuckled and said to a neighbor, "That one, she's only good for errands. Linda's the star." The neighbor had laughed politely, and Evelyn had stood there with her arms full of bags, learning once more that in her father's eyes, her value lay only in service. Now, decades later, standing in a luxury hotel in a borrowed uniform, she felt that same sting sharper, because it confirmed what she had always known. In their world, she was not meant to shine. She was meant to serve. She steadied herself with a breath, lifting the tray again. Guests were arriving in greater numbers now, filling the ballroom with laughter and conversation, dressed in glittering gowns and tailored suits. Evelyn moved silently among them, blending in with the staff. Every so often she would catch someone's eye and see the confusion there. Wasn't that the bride's sister? Why was she carrying champagne? But no one said it aloud. They only stared briefly before turning back to their conversations, pretending not to notice. Her mother passed by once, glancing at Evelyn with sharp approval, as though her daughter's humiliation was nothing more than a successful part of the day's logistics. Evelyn lowered her gaze, holding on to her calm like armor. But inside the fire burned hotter, the voice of her father echoing still only good for errands. If any of the guests noticed the tension in Evelyn's jaw or the steel in her eyes, they did not comment. To them, she was simply another figure in black and white, another hand to deliver wine or clear plates. To Evelyn, it was another chapter in a lifetime of being written off. But even as the sting settled deep, another thought pressed forward. The mask was still on, but behind it she was watching and waiting. The ballroom had begun to glow with the low hum of chatter and the shimmer of crystal chandeliers, and Evelyn moved carefully among the guests, the tray balanced in her hands. She had grown almost used to the weight of the uniform on her shoulders, though every stitch of the stiff fabric was a reminder of her role that day. She kept her face still, her movements precise, as though she belonged in the rhythm of the staff. But the voices that carried across the room made it impossible to forget where she stood. Her mother swept past her with the kind of grandeur that Evelyn had learned never to imitate. Margaret Harper was radiant in her gown, her pearls gleaming, her arm looped proudly through Linda's. "Everyone. This is my daughter Linda," she announced to a circle of arriving guests, her voice full of triumph. "She is the star of our family, a brilliant director of public relations. Her career has been nothing short of dazzling." Applause rippled through the small crowd, polite and admiring. Evelyn stood a few paces away, setting down flutes of champagne unseen but listening to every word. Linda's smile was wide, her hand resting gracefully on the arm of her fiancé. She spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who had never known what it meant to be overlooked. "Our agency just secured a contract with one of the top fashion houses in New York," she said, her tone casual but calculated. "It's a milestone that will redefine our brand. Of course, it took endless hours of networking and cultivating relationships, but that's the nature of this industry." She paused to sip her wine, basking in the murmurs of approval around her. Evelyn caught the eyes of one of the women in the circle, a guest she vaguely remembered from years before. The woman's gaze flicked from Linda, polished and glowing, to Evelyn standing silently with her tray. A small wrinkle of confusion passed over her face before she turned back to Linda, choosing not to question what she saw. That was how it always went. Then her father spoke, his voice carrying a little too loudly across the group. "And of course," he said with a dismissive chuckle, "we're lucky that Evelyn is here to help out today. She's always been so available, a free hand when we need one." His words landed like stones delivered with the careless ease of someone who had never considered their impact. He didn't look at Evelyn when he said it. He didn't need to. His audience laughed politely, and she bowed her head as though the laughter belonged to someone else. As she stepped past a group of guests offering glasses from her tray, a middle-aged man with silver hair glanced at her uniform and asked without hesitation, "Do you work here often?" "The staff at this hotel is always excellent." The question was innocent enough, but it sliced deep. Evelyn forced a small smile, shook her head gently, and kept moving. She had learned that explanations only invited more pity, and pity was a kind of cruelty she no longer wished to endure. All around her, Linda was in her element. She commanded attention as naturally as she breathed. At one point, Evelyn watched from the edge of the room as Linda described the fashion contract in detail, gesturing elegantly, her voice carrying above the hum of conversation. "They came to us because of my vision," she said proudly. "I've always believed in the power of image, and now the industry is finally catching up." Their mother beamed at her, the embodiment of pride. Every nod, every compliment fed the narrative that Linda had been born to shine. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. She did not envy Linda's career, not truly, but she could not ignore the cruel symmetry of it all. Here she stood in uniform, nameless and unnoticed, while her sister's every word was treated as brilliance. It was the same pattern drawn larger and grander, but unchanged from the days when Linda's school recitals overshadowed Evelyn's awards, when Linda's charms erased Evelyn's efforts. Time had only made the divide more dazzling for Linda and more invisible for her. A small group of younger guests passed Evelyn, one whispering just loud enough to be heard. "Isn't that the sister? Why is she dressed like that?" The other shrugged. "Maybe she fell on hard times. At least she's useful." They laughed softly, and Evelyn's grip on the tray tightened until her knuckles whitened. Still, she did not flinch. She had mastered the art of silence, of letting others believe what they wanted. When she turned back toward the head table, she caught a glimpse of Linda meeting eyes with an older executive. The man leaned in close, nodding with admiration as Linda spoke of the strategies that had secured her recent contract. Evelyn could read the exchange easily. She had seen it countless times in her work, though no one here knew of that world she inhabited. From the sidelines, she observed how Linda charmed him with ease, how her parents glowed with pride at every approving nod. Evelyn, standing in her uniform, might as well have been part of the decor. But beneath her stillness, Evelyn felt the old ache sharpen into something else. It was not just pain, but clarity. She knew exactly where she stood in their eyes, and she had known it all her life. Yet watching Linda bask in admiration while she herself was mistaken for hired help made the injustice unmistakable even to those who tried not to see it. Evelyn's invisibility was no accident. It was engineered. She lowered her eyes and continued her work, but a thought burned quietly in the back of her mind. They thought they knew her role. They thought they had written her story. What none of them realized was that invisibility had its advantages. From the shadows one could see everything, and sooner or later everything seen could be used. The hum of conversation in the ballroom rose and fell like a tide, and Evelyn moved with the rhythm of it, carrying trays, pouring wine, and gliding quietly through clusters of guests who never thought to see her as anything other than part of the staff. She had trained herself not to react, not even when her father's words reduced her to little more than a pair of helping hands, or when Linda's voice floated across the room full of triumph about her newest professional conquest. Evelyn kept her focus on the task before her, letting her silence serve as both mask and shield. But when one of the senior waitstaff handed her a carafe of water and asked her to deliver it to the groom's suite, she hesitated just for a moment before nodding. It was a simple errand, nothing more, yet her pulse quickened as she stepped away from the crowd and down the quiet corridor. The air was different here, hushed and heavy with anticipation. She found the suite door ajar, music faintly audible from within. Evelyn knocked once out of habit, then slipped inside with the carafe balanced carefully in her hands. The room was lit, warmly filled with the scent of cologne and polished leather. Daniel Cole, the groom, stood at the mirror adjusting his tie. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his eyes meeting hers. For an instant his expression was blank, polite, the look one gives to hotel staff. Then something shifted. His eyes widened, his face paling slightly as recognition struck. Evelyn set the carafe down on the sideboard. Her movements measured, her face composed. She had seen that look before in other contexts, but never in a setting so intimate, so fraught. Daniel cleared his throat, fumbling with his cufflinks now as though the task demanded all of his attention. "You're—" he began, then stopped. His voice wavered, then steadied. "You're Linda's sister, aren't you?" The words were careful, but his tone betrayed him. Evelyn lifted her gaze to him, calm, unflinching. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Daniel nodded once, then again, as if confirming something to himself. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing through his hair, his tie suddenly in need of adjustment, though it was already straight. His eyes flicked toward her again, searching, and she saw the flicker of uncertainty there. Not the kind born of ignorance, but the kind born of knowledge. Evelyn recognized it instantly. He knew something. There was silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of voices from the hallway. Daniel seemed about to speak again, then hesitated. Instead, he gave a nervous laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Forgive me," he said. "I just thought I'd seen you somewhere before." Evelyn's lips curved in the smallest of smiles, polite but not encouraging. Perhaps, she said softly, nothing more. She would not offer him a lifeline. If he knew, he would have to speak it aloud. She would not do that work for him. His gaze dropped to the carafe she had placed on the table, then lifted again with a kind of restless energy. He looked at her the way someone might look at a puzzle they already half-solved but dared not finish. And in his eyes, Evelyn caught the glint of recognition not from casual acquaintance, but from something deeper, something professional. She had seen it before in the eyes of men who read the trades, who scanned Forbes, and the business pages who studied the profiles of those climbing quickly in industries they cared about. He stopped again, his voice trailing off. The unspoken words hovered in the air, suspended between them. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, waiting her composure unshaken. Daniel exhaled sharply as though wrestling with himself, then finally muttered almost under his breath, "Grand Muse Events. That's you." The name lingered in the space like a spark. Evelyn did not flinch, though her heart beat steady and strong. Instead, she regarded him with quiet neutrality. "You must read more than just the society pages," she replied gently. Her tone carried no pride, no challenge, only fact. Daniel's throat worked as he swallowed hard, his face betraying the conflict he seemed desperate to hide. There was a feature, he said quickly, a piece in Forbes last spring. About a woman who built her company from nothing. Grand Muse, the fastest-growing event agency on the East Coast. I remember the photo. You were there." Evelyn inclined her head once in acknowledgement. She offered no elaboration, no explanation. Let him sit with the weight of what he had discovered. His composure cracked for just a second, and in that fracture Evelyn saw unease bordering on fear. He looked away, then back at her, his mouth opening as though to ask the question he couldn't bring himself to voice. Finally he managed, "You're really Linda's sister?" The words sounded incredulous, as if he couldn't reconcile the image of the polished executive from the article with the woman standing before him in a server's uniform. "Yes," Evelyn answered. Her voice was calm even. "I am Linda's sister." She left it at that, letting the silence fill the room again. The quiet grew thick, and Daniel shifted from foot to foot, tugging at his cufflinks once more. His face carried an unease that Evelyn recognized well, the dawning realization that the story he thought he knew was incomplete, and the knowledge unsettled him. Evelyn smoothed her hands down the sides of her uniform, every gesture deliberate. She met his gaze with cool steadiness, offering him nothing more. Whatever storm he felt, it was his to reckon with, not hers. Yet inside she felt the faintest flicker of something new. Not satisfaction exactly, but the awareness that for the first time that day, someone in this family's orbit had been forced to see her as more than invisible. She turned to leave, pausing only to say in that same measured tone, "Your water is on the table. Good luck with your preparations." And then she slipped out of the room, her footsteps quiet in the hall, leaving Daniel staring after her, caught between what he thought he knew and what he had just seen. The ballroom glittered brighter as the evening deepened, laughter rising above the clink of silverware and the rustle of silk gowns. Evelyn moved through the tables with a tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her steps silent, her expression composed. She had just left Daniel in his suite not long before, his unsettled face lingering in her memory. But she carried no sign of that encounter on her face now. To the guests, she was invisible, just another servant moving through the grand affair. At the far end of the room, the head table stretched beneath a cascade of white roses, gleaming crystal glasses lined like soldiers in a row. This was the domain of her family, Linda radiant in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, her smile carefully curated for every admiring glance. Her parents seated with pride, stiff in their posture, basking in borrowed glory, and beside Linda, Daniel, his jaw-set eyes shifting from one guest to the next. Evelyn approached slowly, the tray of wineglasses glinting in the low light. The conversations at the table paused as she arrived, not out of recognition, but because the service of wine demanded attention. She set one glass before her mother, another before her father, the gestures precise and silent. Then she turned toward Daniel, extending the final glass. He reached for it with a hand that trembled more than a groom's hand should on his wedding night. His fingers brushed the stem, then faltered. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the glass-tipped ruby wine spilling across Evelyn's sleeve and splashing dark across her uniform. The sound of liquid striking fabric was soft, but the collective intake of breath from the table was not. Evelyn froze, steadying the tray in one hand, her other hand instinctively pulling the glass upright before it shattered. She lifted her eyes to Daniel, whose face had drained of color. His lips parted, his gaze locked on her with something raw, unguarded. And then before he could stop himself, the word burst out of him. Boss. The single syllable cracked through the air louder than any clatter of glass could have been. The table fell silent. Conversations at neighboring tables faltered as guests turned their heads. Margaret Harper's fork paused midair. Linda's smile stiffened, her eyes narrowing in confusion. And Daniel, realizing too late what he had said, looked as though the floor itself might swallow him whole. Evelyn's eyes flickered just for a moment, sharp and knowing, but her expression remained otherwise serene. She reached calmly for a napkin, blotting at the dark stain on her sleeve, as though nothing unusual had passed between them. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice low and even, as if she hadn't heard the word at all. She placed the empty glass gently on the tray and began to turn away. But the silence that gripped the head table clung to the entire room. Guests leaned forward, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Boss. The word hung above them, incongruous, unexplained. The groom had called the server boss. Margaret was the first to react, though her voice was brittle. Daniel, what on earth, she began, but he shook his head quickly, his mouth tightening as he scrambled to recover. Just slipped, he said, his laugh hollow, unconvincing. Slipped my tongue. His hand shook as he reached for another glass, and though he tried to steady himself, the strain in his movements betrayed him. Linda turned her head sharply toward him, her painted smile faltering. "What did you just call her?" she whispered, her tone laced with suspicion. Evelyn caught the words, though she kept her back turned, her hands steady as she carried the tray away from the table. Every step she took felt deliberate, her posture regale even in the uniform meant to humiliate her. She moved as if she were indeed the boss, as if she had orchestrated this very moment. And perhaps in a way she had, though she had spoken no word, the truth had slipped free from someone else's lips. The murmur spread quickly, rippling outward. "Did he say boss?" one guest whispered. To her, another asked, disbelief coloring the hushed voices. Chairs shifted as heads turned to follow Evelyn's retreating figure. She did not hurry. She allowed the silence and the whispers to trail her like a cloak. At the head table, Daniel sat rigid, his hand clenched around the stem of a fresh glass, though he did not drink. Linda leaned toward him, her eyes sharp. "Why would you call her that?" she hissed. He shook his head again, muttering something about nerves, about the stress of the day, but the color had not returned to his face. Margaret and Robert Harper exchanged confused glances, the proud image they had tried so hard to maintain beginning to fracture under the weight of a single word. Evelyn slipped through the crowd, pausing only to set her tray on a side table. Her hand brushed lightly against the stain on her sleeve, the deep red spreading across the fabric like a wound. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, heavy with questions they were too polite to ask. Yet she offered them nothing, no explanation, no acknowledgement, only the same poised silence she had worn all evening. But in her eyes, had anyone looked closely enough, was a glint of steel, a spark that revealed more than she allowed her lips to say. For in that single moment, with one careless word, the balance of power in the room had shifted. The hall remained hushed long after she left the head table, the clinking of cutlery, failing to resume conversations, slow to restart. Everyone waited for someone to explain, for someone to smooth over the crack that had just split the glossy surface of the Harper family's grand performance. But no explanation came. Evelyn disappeared into the service corridor, her back straight, her chin lifted. She had not spoken, but she had been heard. And for the first time that evening, she knew that the family who had worked so hard to make her invisible could no longer pretend she wasn't there. The word Daniel had uttered still lingered in the air long after Evelyn retreated from the head table. Boss. It had struck like lightning, illuminating a truth no one else in the room could yet explain. But Evelyn carried herself away as if nothing had happened. She kept her composure, though. Inside she felt the stir of old memories pressing at the edges of her mind, memories she had fought to bury beneath years of silence. Moments like this, when the surface cracked, had a way of pulling the past back into sharp focus. As she slipped through a side corridor, she remembered the first time her family had decided she was no longer one of them. She remembered the betrayal that had set the course of her life. She had been 18 then, a girl standing on the cusp of adulthood with dreams of college and a quiet hope that one day she might matter to her parents as much as her younger sister. The Harper household had been filled with tension that summer, though Evelyn did not understand why until the night her father stormed into her room holding a bank statement in one hand. His face was red, his voice trembling with rage. $10,000, he thundered. Gone. And your name is on the withdrawal. Evelyn had blinked in confusion, rising from her desk where she had been studying. What? I don't. But her words died as he shoved the paper into her hands. There it was, her name scrawled at the bottom of a withdrawal slip ink that looked eerily like her own handwriting. Only it wasn't. She knew that instantly. The signature was familiar, but off just enough that she could see the hand behind it. Linda's hand. Her mother's voice had cut in from the doorway, sharp and cold. We trusted you with our savings, Evelyn. That money was meant for Linda's tuition for her future. And you stole it. No. Evelyn cried, her throat tight. I would never. Linda, tell them. But Linda had been there too, hovering in the hallway with wide, practiced eyes. She shook her head slowly, her lips pressed into a trembling line. I didn't want to believe it either, she whispered, but the signature. It's hers, Dad. I saw her with the checkbook last week. The memory still burned even now, years later. Evelyn had pleaded with them, begged them to believe her, but her parents would not listen. They had already chosen who to protect and who to sacrifice. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, harsh and final. You are a thief, Evelyn, a traitor to this family. Get out before you disgrace us further. She had been shoved out the door with nothing more than a hastily packed bag and the echo of her mother's words following her down the porch steps. You'll never amount to anything. You've shamed us. The door had slammed shut, leaving her in the dark. That night had been the beginning of exile. With nowhere to go, Evelyn slept in the back of a bus station, her small bag clutched tightly against her chest. The next weeks blurred together in a haze of survival. She washed dishes in diners, swept floors in gas stations, and took any job that would pay for a meal or a place to sleep. She learned quickly how to stretch $1 until it tore, how to smile at strangers, so they might offer a little kindness, how to keep moving forward even when her heart was broken. Every humiliation pressed into her like a brand. Once she remembered serving coffee at a roadside cafe when a group of Linda's friends walked in laughing and ordering as though she were invisible. She had stood behind the counter with her hands trembling, praying they would not recognize her. But even if they had, what could she have said? Her family had already painted her as a thief. In their eyes, her voice no longer carried weight. What stung most in those early days was not the hunger or the endless work, but the knowledge that her parents had never asked for proof. They had never paused to consider that Linda, their golden child, might have been capable of deception. They had chosen the easy narrative. Evelyn, the older daughter who had always been useful but never celebrated, had betrayed them. And Linda, bright, beautiful Linda, had remained untarnished. In truth, Evelyn had pieced the puzzle together over time. Linda's forged signature had been clumsy, but it had been enough. $10,000 money set aside for the future had disappeared, and Evelyn had paid the price. Years later, she would learn through whispers from a distant cousin that Linda had used the money to fund an extravagant internship in Paris, one that boosted her career in public relations. The betrayal had not just ruined Evelyn's standing in her family, it had become the foundation of Linda's success. Standing in the service corridor of the hotel, now Evelyn let the memory wash over her in all its cruelty. She could still feel the weight of her father's condemnation, the sting of her mother's disappointment, the hollow smile Linda had worn as she sealed her sister's fate. That night had shaped everything that followed. And yet, Evelyn had survived. She had clawed her way back from nothing, building a life out of the ashes of her family's rejection. She had lived years without their support, without their acknowledgement, driven by the memory of being cast out. That fire had forged her into something stronger than they could ever imagine. Still, the memory of that night remained raw. To the world outside, she was calm, competent, invisible in her uniform. But within her, the 18-year-old girl who had been branded a traitor still lived, her voice echoing in the silence. I didn't take it. I never did. And now, standing at her sister's wedding, Evelyn felt a strange sense of inevitability. The truth always found its way to the surface, and one day, the lies Linda had built her life upon would collapse under their own weight. Evelyn carried the memory of that night at 18, like a scar invisible to the world, but etched so deeply into her that it shaped everything she became. Cast out with nothing, condemned as a thief, she learned quickly that survival depended on more than endurance. It demanded transformation. If her family had written her off as a failure, she would prove them wrong in the only way she could, by building a life that required no one's approval but her own. What began as scraping by on odd jobs became a relentless pursuit of knowledge. She spent her nights in public libraries devouring books on business design and event management, her hunger for understanding fueled by the same fire that had once burned with humiliation. During the day, she worked as a waitress, a receptionist, an assistant to anyone who would hire her, absorbing every detail of how people organized, how they persuaded, how they impressed. She studied not just with her mind, but with her eyes, storing away the small truths of presentation and timing of what made a gathering memorable. Her first break came when she convinced a small restaurant owner to let her organize a private party for a client. She promised him she could do better than the generic arrangements they usually offered. With nothing but instinct and determination, she transformed the space with borrowed linens and flowers salvaged from a wholesaler's leftovers. The party was a success, and word of mouth brought her 3 more clients within a month. From there, she moved with deliberate patience, reinvesting every dollar, expanding, slowly building connections without ever trading on her family's name. Years blurred together, one job leading to another, until Grand Muse Events was born. It began in a rented office no larger than a bedroom, with Evelyn doing everything herself, planning, purchasing, staffing, even carrying crates when no one else was available. But within 5 years, the company had grown into something formidable, an enterprise with 50 employees and contracts that placed her in the inner circles of luxury and fashion. Gucci came first, a brand launch that dazzled the press and cemented her reputation. Then Vogue, a gala that people whispered about for months afterward. Each success stacked atop the last, not as gifts, not as accidents, but as proof of her relentless drive. Through it all, she remained silent where her family was concerned. For 10 years she did not call, did not write, did not send word of her life. They had cast her out, and she had let them believe she had vanished. It was easier that way. Easier to let them imagine her drifting from one odd job to the next than to let them glimpse the empire she was quietly building. She told herself she didn't care if they ever knew, though. In the quiet hours of the night, she admitted that a part of her longed for the day when the truth would break through their blindness. The irony, however, was never lost on her. More than once, Linda's name had appeared on proposals sent to Grand Muse Events. Her sister's PR firm was eager to collaborate with one of the fastest-rising event companies in New York, eager to attach itself to the glamour Evelyn had crafted. Evelyn had read the proposals with a steady gaze, recognizing Linda's flair and the language, the same blend of charm and ambition she had wielded since childhood. But Evelyn never revealed herself. She had her assistant send a polite rejection, noting that Grand Muse had chosen a different PR partner. Linda would never know that the faceless CEO who declined her was the very sister she had betrayed. That moment, more than most, filled Evelyn with a sharp satisfaction. Not cruelty, but justice. She had no need to humiliate Linda publicly then. The simple knowledge that her sister had unknowingly reached for her approval and been denied was enough. It reminded her that invisibility could be power when wielded carefully. She remained unseen by her family, but in the world beyond them, she had become someone others called upon, someone whose name appeared in glossy magazines and whose work set standards for an entire industry. Now walking through the hotel ballroom in her server's uniform, Evelyn felt the cruel beauty of the contrast. To her family, she was still the invisible one, the sister good only for errands. But in truth, she was the architect of moments that the powerful and the wealthy paid dearly to experience. The guests who glanced at her that night had no idea they were being served by the same woman who had orchestrated galas they had attended, who had shaped evenings they had praised without ever knowing her name. That duality burned inside her as she watched Linda preen at the head table, her every word a performance. To the Harpers, Linda was the family's crown jewel, the embodiment of success. To Evelyn, Linda was a hollow shell propped up by lies, her career polished but fragile. Evelyn had built something real, something lasting, and she had done it in silence. She thought of her office back in Manhattan, the polished conference table where her team gathered, the walls lined with framed press clippings and photographs of events that had set the industry buzzing. Her employees called her a leader, a visionary, a boss who demanded excellence but offered loyalty in return. That word boss had already slipped from Daniel's lips once tonight, and the sound of it still echoed through her. The world she had built and the world her family forced her into were colliding, and though she kept her composure, she could feel the inevitability of what was coming. In the quiet corners of her mind, Evelyn knew this was the stage on which all the years of silence would finally break. She had not needed her family to succeed. She had not needed their money, their connections, or their approval. And yet, standing here in a borrowed uniform, she also knew that when the truth came to light, the contrast between who they believed she was and who she had become would be devastating. Daniel's slip at the head table had fractured the night, leaving whispers circling the ballroom like restless birds. Evelyn had walked away with steady steps, but she could feel eyes following her, questions hanging in the air unspoken. She returned to the quieter corners of the hotel, letting the hum of conversation fade behind her when she heard a voice calling softly from the shadows of a side hall. "Wait." It was Daniel. His tone carried an urgency that made her stop, though she did not turn right away. When she did, he was already stepping closer, his expression pale and strained, so different from the composed Groom everyone else thought they knew. He glanced around before speaking, lowering his voice, though there was no one nearby. "I need to explain," he said quickly, almost desperately. Evelyn held his gaze, her face unreadable, offering him no relief. He ran a hand through his hair, the calm Groom slipping away to reveal a man on edge. "I know who you are," he admitted. "I recognized you from Forbes months ago. I hired a private investigator before the engagement party." The words tumbled out, each one heavier than the last. "I needed to know who Linda really was, and what I found, it wasn't what I expected." Evelyn's brow arched slightly, but she said nothing. Silence was her power, and she wielded it now. Daniel exhaled sharply, his voice breaking with frustration. "She's been lying to me. For months." The detective found evidence, photos, messages. She's been involved with someone else. Not just anyone either. A guest here tonight, the CEO of one of the biggest fashion houses in New York. His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "Do you understand what that means? She's marrying me for what I represent, for the money, the connections. I was blind, but I'm not anymore." The revelation struck the air like a stone into water, sending ripples of consequence outward. Evelyn kept her expression calm, though inside she felt the sharp click of puzzle pieces falling into place. So that was why Linda had carried herself with such triumphant arrogance, why she had boasted about her contracts without fear. She had not built her image alone. She had been leveraging more than charm, she had been trading in betrayal. Daniel's eyes searched Evelyn's face, desperate for some sign of response. "I didn't want to believe it." he confessed, his voice dropping low. "But the proof is there. She's been meeting him in secret and I can't ignore it anymore. I thought marrying Linda meant I'd found someone ambitious, someone who could stand beside me. Instead, I'm beginning to wonder if I've just been a stepping stone." Evelyn let the silence stretch, weighing the weight of his words. In her chest she felt the echo of old betrayals, the familiar sting of Linda's lies. None of this surprised her, not truly. Linda had always been willing to sacrifice someone else for her own gain. This, though, was different. This was not just the ruin of a sister's reputation. It was the seed of something far larger, something that could topple the entire illusion Linda had so carefully crafted. Still, Evelyn did not speak. She knew better than to show her hand. She watched Daniel wrestle with his own turmoil, his face taut with fear and anger. He mistook her silence for judgment for wisdom, and in a way it was. By saying nothing, she allowed the weight of the truth to hang fully on his shoulders, to dig deeper into his conscience. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he admitted at last, his voice trembling. "Maybe because when I look at you, I see someone who isn't fooled by her act. Maybe because you're the only person here who actually understands what she's capable of." His eyes softened, almost pleading. "She thinks she can control everything, but she doesn't control me anymore. Not after this." Evelyn's gaze flickered sharp as glass. She inclined her head slightly enough to acknowledge his words, but not enough to reveal agreement. Inside, her mind was already moving quickly, cataloging what he had said, placing it alongside what she already knew. Linda had betrayed her once with a forged signature that stole her future. Now she was betraying her fiancé with secrets that could destroy her own. Evelyn could see the arc of it already, how the truth would unravel, how the Harper family's glittering performance would collapse under the weight of its own lies. But aloud she said nothing. She let Daniel's confession hang between them, heavy and unresolved. He looked at her as though waiting for advice, for guidance, for some word of comfort, but Evelyn offered him none. Her silence was sharper than any words she might have spoken. Daniel finally nodded, as though reaching his own conclusion. "You won't say anything, will you?" His question was more statement than plea. Evelyn's lips curved just slightly, not enough to be a smile, but enough to remind him that she was not someone to underestimate. "No," she said at last, her voice steady, cool. "I won't say anything." Relief flickered across his face, but it was uneasy, fragile. He knew she had heard him, that she now carried the knowledge he had tried to shoulder alone. And perhaps that frightened him more than if she had promised to intervene. As Daniel turned away, running a hand down his face, Evelyn watched him go with eyes that glimmered in the dim light. In her silence, she held the truth like a blade, sharp and ready, though she had not yet chosen how to use it. The night was not over. The stage was still set and Linda's performance still unfolding. But now Evelyn had been handed a secret so powerful it could split the entire play in two. For the first time in years, she felt the familiar pulse of justice rising steady and undeniable. Her sister had once destroyed her life with a lie. Now Linda's own lies had ripened into weapons, and Evelyn knew she would not have to strike hard to watch the entire illusion fall. All she had to do was wait. Evelyn had walked away from Daniel with the weight of his confession tucked neatly into her silence. The knowledge of Linda's betrayal was a spark waiting for tinder, but Evelyn did not rush to set it aflame. She knew the value of timing. Back in the ballroom, she returned to her role with the same calm precision, carrying trays, pouring drinks, smiling politely when addressed. To the untrained eye, she was nothing more than a servant. To Evelyn, it was the perfect disguise. It allowed her to drift unseen where others were watched, to linger unnoticed where whispers were traded. And in those quiet spaces, she began to collect her evidence. Near the side of the ballroom, by a cluster of marble pillars, Linda leaned close to a tall man in a sleek black suit. Evelyn recognized him instantly. The CEO Daniel had mentioned the man at the heart of Linda's infidelity. Their posture told a story even before their words did. His hand brushing Linda's arm, her laugh pitched just a little too softly, too intimately. Evelyn adjusted the tray in her hands, her phone angled discreetly beneath the linen. With one tap, the microphone activated, recording their exchange. Another subtle movement, and the camera lens captured the moment when Linda slipped him a small envelope, her manicured hand lingering in his. Evelyn's face remained serene as she moved away, but inside her thoughts churned. It was more than infidelity. The envelope suggested business deals made in shadows. She remembered how Linda had once gloated about landing contracts that seemed far beyond her firm's reach. Watching her now, Evelyn realized those successes were not born of brilliance but of secret bargains. And Evelyn recorded it all, the audio capturing every hushed word, every promise. As she moved through the ballroom, her mind replayed another voice, one she had carried for years. Her mother's cold and dismissive slicing through her memory. "You will never be as good as Linda." That sentence had been repeated like scripture in their home, woven into every comparison, every judgment. It echoed now as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. For a moment, she felt the ache of that wound, the girl she had been at 18, shrinking under the weight of it. But then the ache hardened into resolve. If her mother had crowned Linda as the star, then tonight Evelyn would be the force that revealed the star's light as nothing but a flickering illusion. Later in the evening, when the guests' attention shifted toward a toast at the head table, Evelyn stepped quietly into the service hallway. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a number she had not used in years. It belonged to someone who had once worked for Linda, a junior associate who had left her firm under bitter circumstances. Evelyn had kept the contact tucked away, an instinctive move back when she was first building her own empire. Now it felt prophetic. The call connected after 2 rings. "Hello?" The voice was wary, cautious. Evelyn introduced herself, keeping her tone calm and professional. There was a pause, then recognition. "I remember you," the voice said slowly. "Grand Muse. Why are you calling me now?" "I think you know," Evelyn replied. "I need information about Linda Harper." "And I believe you have it." There was another pause, longer this time. Then the former employee sighed. "She ruined me," he admitted. "She set me up to take the fall for missing funds I later discovered she had siphoned into her personal accounts. I wanted to fight, but she had her parents, her lawyers. I walked away instead." His bitterness seeped through every word. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. She had suspected corruption, but hearing it confirmed was like finding the missing piece of a puzzle she had been assembling for years. "Would you be willing to share proof?" she asked, her tone steady, though her pulse raced. "I kept copies," he said. "I always thought the day would come when she'd cross the wrong person. Maybe that day is today." A faint smile touched Evelyn's lips, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Send them to me," she said. "You'll be doing more than you realize." When the call ended, she leaned back against the wall, the sounds of laughter and music muffled through the heavy doors. She allowed herself a slow exhale. She had audio photographs and soon documents of fraud. Each piece alone was damning. Together they would be unassailable, and all gathered while she wore the mask of a servant, while her family and their guests dismissed her as background. She returned to the ballroom, lifting her tray once more, her expression unchanged. From across the room, Linda caught her eye briefly, not with recognition, but with the casual disdain of someone looking past the help. Evelyn met her gaze just long enough to let her own eyes sharpen the barest flicker of steel before turning away. It was calculated, precise, a smile without warmth, a signal only Evelyn understood. In that moment, she knew the balance of power had already shifted. She would not need to shout or accuse or demand. She would let Linda's own choices condemn her. All Evelyn had to do was wait for the right stage, the right moment, and then reveal what had always been true. Linda was not a star. She was a fraud. The night had reached its peak of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished tables. Waiters moved gracefully between guests, carrying silver trays. And Linda glowed at the head table, as though the entire evening existed solely for her to shine. Evelyn remained in the shadows, Her uniform still immaculate despite hours of service, her presence unnoticed, her mind sharp. Every detail of her plan had been carefully set in motion. She had waited years for this night, and now the moment approached with the inevitability of a storm. At precisely the hour when the speeches were winding down and the guests were beginning to relax into the rhythm of food and laughter, the lights dimmed. A hush fell across the ballroom guests, turning their eyes toward the massive screen that had been arranged for a slideshow of family photos and carefully curated memories. Linda's voice rose in practiced surprise, her smile spreading as though she hadn't approved every detail herself. A little something for everyone to enjoy, she called out, her eyes sparkling with pride. The first images appeared, childhood pictures of Linda in frilly dresses, her parents beaming beside her, snapshots of school awards and glamorous internships. Guests applauded politely, some cooing at the sweet nostalgia. Evelyn remained still in the corner, her tray empty now, her eyes fixed on the screen. Then, as the reel transitioned to what should have been the engagement photos, the feed shifted. A different video began to play, its grainy quality at first causing confusion among the guests. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Then the scene became clear. Linda, unmistakable in her designer coat, leaning against the gleaming car of the fashion executive, her laughter caught on the microphone, her hand gripping his as their lips met in a kiss far too intimate to be mistaken. The camera angle shifted, revealing more exchanges of envelopes, whispered words amplified just enough to be heard. "No one will ever know." Gasps broke out across the room. A fork clattered to the floor. The polite laughter and applause evaporated, replaced by a stunned silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Margaret Harper shot to her feet, her hand flying to her mouth. Robert's face drained of color as he fumbled for the remote, his voice shaking as he barked at the staff to stop the video. But the hacker's work was precise. The footage continued to play, image after damning image, voice after voice, undeniable in its clarity. Linda's chair screeched backward as she rose, her face pale, her composure cracking. "This is a lie!" she shouted, her voice shrill. "It's fabricated, it's not real!" But the evidence glared at her from the screen, her gestures, her words, her betrayal on full display for every guest to see. Her protests only made the scene more pitiful, her desperation more transparent. The guests, once eager admirers, now whispered with disgust. Some covered their mouths, others leaned toward one another with wide-eyed disbelief. "She's been cheating with him here." The room swelled with the noise of scandal, the glamour of the evening collapsing under the weight of what they were watching. Margaret stumbled toward the screen, her voice cracking. Turn it off, now." But the video played on, showing Linda and the man entering a hotel room, her laughter trailing behind them as the door shut. There was no denying it. No speech could repair the damage. Linda turned wildly toward Daniel, her hands reaching out as if to plead. "You know me. You know this isn't." But Daniel stood frozen, his expression grim, the truth already carved into his face. He said nothing, and his silence cut deeper than any accusation could. In the corner of the room, Evelyn remained still. She had not moved since the video began, her lips curved into a smile so faint it barely existed. But in her eyes there was no warmth, only the cool satisfaction of justice long overdue. For years she had been forced into invisibility, branded a thief cast aside for her sister's glory. Tonight she had pulled the curtain back. The fraud was revealed, and there was no going back. The chaos built to a fever pitch. Some guests rose and left, unwilling to be part of the spectacle. Others stayed eager to watch the Harper family unravel in real time. Margaret clutched Robert's arm, her voice rising in frantic denials, insisting there must be a mistake. Linda's shrieks grew more desperate, her attempts at explanation falling flat against the undeniable evidence on the screen. The ballroom, once the stage of a perfect society wedding, now throbbed with scandal. The flowers, the candles, the carefully chosen decor, all of it now served as the backdrop to humiliation. Guests pulled out phones, recording the scene, capturing Linda's collapse, Margaret's horror, Robert's stunned silence. Within hours, the footage would travel beyond the walls of this hotel, spreading across social circles, feeding the hunger for gossip. Evelyn remained in her corner, calm and unhurried, watching the destruction unfold exactly as she had planned. She had not needed to speak a word, not needed to raise her voice. Her silence, her patience, her precision had done what years of argument never could. She had shown the truth, and the truth had turned a glittering wedding into a public disaster. As the final moments of the clip ended and the screen went black, the room buzzed with outrage and disbelief. Linda collapsed back into her chair, sobbing, her makeup streaked, her carefully crafted image shattered. Margaret clung to Robert, her face gray with shame. Daniel remained standing silent, his decision still to come. And Evelyn, unseen by most, allowed herself one final cold smile. The collapse had begun, and she had only just lit the match. The ballroom had become a battlefield of whispers and gasps after the scandalous video ended. Linda sat hunched in her chair, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her cries high-pitched and desperate, while Margaret clung to Robert, demanding explanations no one could give. Guests shifted uneasily, some standing to leave others watching with wide-eyed hunger for the drama unfolding. In the middle of it all, Daniel remained upright, his face carved in stone, his silence louder than Linda's protests. Every eye turned toward him, waiting for the groom's verdict. The wedding could not proceed without his word, and in that moment, he held the fate of the Harper family in his hands. Linda scrambled toward him, her hand clutching at his sleeve. "Daniel, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You know me, you know I would never, this is a lie, some horrible trick. You can't believe it." But Daniel's eyes, cold and steady, did not soften. He looked at her, not as a bride, but as a stranger, one who had deceived him in ways too deep to forgive. He pulled his arm free, his movements deliberate, the gesture final. The hush grew unbearable, a silence so heavy it pressed on the chest. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice cutting clean through the noise. "This wedding is over." His words rang with such finality that a murmur swept through the crowd, guests exchanging looks of shock and grim satisfaction. Margaret gasped audibly. Robert groaned, and Linda staggered back as if she had been struck. Daniel straightened his gaze, sweeping the room before landing on Evelyn, who stood at the edge of the chaos, calm and collected. His voice carried clear enough for all to hear. "If there is anyone here tonight worthy of respect, it is not this family that parades virtue while hiding lies. It is Evelyn. She has shown more dignity in her silence than any of you have in your wealth or pretense." The words cut through the Harper family like a blade. Margaret's face drained of color, her hand gripping Robert's arm as though she might collapse. Robert muttered something under his breath, but his voice failed him. Linda let out a strangled cry, collapsing to her knees in her white gown, her pleas devolving into incoherent sobs. The guests erupted into hushed conversations, some nodding, others smirking at the brutal honesty of Daniel's statement. Margaret tried to recover, stepping forward, her voice trembling but urgent. "Daniel, wait. Please listen. This was a mistake, a misunderstanding. We can explain, we can fix this. Don't let one fabrication ruin what we've built here tonight." She gestured helplessly toward Linda, who continued to weep at his feet. "She loves you. She made a mistake." Daniel's eyes blazed as he turned to her. "A mistake." His voice rose sharp and unwavering. "This wasn't a mistake. It was betrayal. And what's worse, you knew the kind of woman you were raising, and you celebrated it. You threw away the daughter who showed you loyalty, and you held up this fraud as your pride." His hand swept in Evelyn's direction, his tone bitter. "You treated her like a servant while the world knows her for what she is. A leader, a boss. More respectable than any Harper in this room." The impact of his words hit like thunder. Evelyn felt the weight of every eye on her, yet she did not flinch, did not shift. Her silence remained her armor, her strength. The guests' stares turned, some filled with new recognition, others with curiosity as though seeing her for the first time. And through it all, Evelyn held her posture, her chin lifted, her expression cool, refusing to give her family the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. Robert tried next. his voice low and imploring. "Daniel, don't do this. This family has influence resources. We can make this right if you'll just—" Daniel cut him off with a glare so sharp, Robert faltered mid-sentence. "I don't want your influence. I don't want your resources. And I will not tie myself to a family that builds its name on deceit." He looked down at Linda, who clutched at his shoes with trembling fingers. "You disgust me," he said, his tone flat. "The wedding is off." "You are nothing to me." The silence that followed was broken only by Linda's sobbing. Guests began to rise, some making their way to the exits, shaking their heads at the spectacle. The air was heavy with humiliation, the once gilded celebration reduced to rubble in a single declaration. Margaret made one final attempt, her voice breaking. "Please, Daniel, don't leave like this. Think of what people will say." Daniel turned sharply, his expression unreadable. "They'll say the truth, that I had the courage to walk away from lies, that I saw honor where you saw shame." He looked once more at Evelyn, his eyes steady, then turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the bride, the family, and the ruins of their pride. Linda collapsed fully to the floor, her gown pooling around her like a shroud. Margaret sank into her chair, her face hidden in her hands, while Robert stared blankly ahead, as though the collapse of everything he had built had just begun to register. The guests whispered louder now, some pitying, most scornful, their glances cutting like knives. And Evelyn, still in the shadows, allowed herself the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of vindication. The family that had once cast her aside had been struck down publicly, and she had not needed to lift a finger in the moment. Daniel had spoken the words she had carried in her heart for years, words her parents would never have allowed themselves to hear otherwise. Evelyn was not the servant. She was the one who had endured, the one who had risen, the one who had won. The aftermath of Daniel's declaration reverberated long after he walked out of the ballroom. The stunned silence had quickly transformed into hushed whispers, and by the time dawn touched the Hamptons skyline, the Harper wedding was no longer a private humiliation. It was a public spectacle. The first shaky videos from guests had already surfaced online. By morning, Twitter feeds were flooded with clips of Linda weeping, Daniel denouncing her in front of hundreds, and the damning video of her betrayal flashing across a massive wedding screen. The hashtag #$1,000,000 meltdown trended within hours, climbing to the top of social media charts. Headlines followed swiftly. Harper wedding implodes, groom walks out. After infidelity, exposed, and from vows to viral. The scandal that shook the Hamptons. Instagram accounts devoted to society gossip posted photo after photo of the ruined reception, captions dripping with sarcasm about champagne glasses raised in shock instead of celebration. What had once been meticulously curated as the event of the season now spread like wildfire as the scandal of the year. Morning news programs replayed the footage on loop anchors, shaking their heads at the irony of a $1,000,000 wedding reduced to chaos by betrayal. One segment on a popular talk show began with the mocking line, "They ordered cake, but got scandal served instead." The Harper family, once held in esteem in their social circle, became a punchline overnight. Linda, who had prided herself on being the polished face of the family, bore the heaviest blow. Her PR career, built on image and illusion, depended on trust and reputation. Now both lay shattered. In the days that followed, the second wave of disaster struck when an anonymous account began releasing documents online accompanied by damning captions. The account belonged to a former employee, someone Linda had wronged in her relentless climb upward. Screenshots of emails, falsified invoices, and bank transfers revealed that Linda had embezzled funds from her own firm, redirecting client money into personal accounts to finance her lavish lifestyle. The revelations hit the media like fresh gasoline on an already roaring fire. Articles shifted from gossip about her failed wedding to investigative pieces titled "The Double Life of Linda Harper" and "From Bride to Fraud: The Untold Story of a PR Heiress." News anchors who had once praised her for her networking savvy now dissected her schemes with cold precision. Clients moved quickly to distance themselves. A luxury brand that had featured her in their campaigns issued a terse statement: "We are terminating all associations with Harper PR effective immediately." A cosmetics giant followed, pulling out of a multi-million-dollar contract. Within a week, nearly every significant client had cut ties. Former partners spoke to the press, their statements thinly veiled condemnations. "We value integrity, something Harper PR has proven to lack." Linda's empire crumbled in real-time, contracts dissolving faster than she could attempt to spin them. Colleagues whispered of bankruptcy while society pages speculated on lawsuits soon to come. For a woman who had built her identity around power lunches and front-row seats at fashion shows, the humiliation was total. She had been unmasked, not just as an unfaithful fiancée, but as a dishonest businesswoman, her image collapsing in both private and professional spheres. Margaret and Robert, once so proud to parade their younger daughter as a symbol of success, now hid from the spotlight. Photographers camped outside their Connecticut estate, shouting questions they refused to answer. "Did you know about the embezzlement? How do you respond to Daniel's accusations?" Their silence only deepened the public's appetite for judgment. Evelyn watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She had not needed to lift her voice or declare revenge. The world had done it for her, fueled by Linda's own choices. Each headline, each lost contract, each mocking comment online was a reminder that the truth, once revealed, had a momentum all its own. The irony was striking. Linda, who had thrived on controlling narratives for clients, now found herself powerless as the narrative about her spun wildly out of control. Within 2 weeks, Harper PR announced a temporary suspension of operations, though insiders confirmed it was closer to a permanent collapse. Employees fled, seeking new jobs before the sinking ship dragged them under. The office, once bustling with ambition, sat nearly deserted, its glossy sign a hollow promise. Meanwhile, society gossipers savored every detail. One column ended with a particularly cutting line: "In trying to outshine everyone, Linda Harper burned herself to ash." The collapse was complete, spanning every corner of Linda's life. A broken engagement, public disgrace, financial ruin, and a name now synonymous with scandal. The Harper family's carefully cultivated image of wealth and virtue lay in tatters, each new revelation tearing it further apart. And Evelyn, the sister they had dismissed, remained silent, still watching as justice unfolded in ways more poetic than she could have ever scripted. The downfall of Linda's career had not only destroyed her reputation, but dragged the Harper name into disgrace. Headlines multiplied each day, old clients spoke out with contempt, and the video of the wedding disaster still circulated online, a constant reminder of betrayal and humiliation. As the weeks passed, the once proud Harper family found themselves cornered, their wealth unable to buy back dignity or silence critics. It was in that climate of desperation that Margaret and Robert appeared unannounced at Evelyn's temporary apartment, the same. Evelyn they had cast out years earlier, now standing as the one person who held power over their crumbling legacy. When Evelyn opened the door, she did not greet them with warmth. Her expression was calm, controlled, her eyes steady as she looked at the parents who had once expelled her from their home without hesitation. Margaret's face was pale-lined, deeper with the stress of endless nights avoiding reporters. Robert's shoulders sagged, the posture of a man defeated. For a moment, none of them spoke, the silence carrying the weight of decades. Margaret was the first to break. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." Evelyn stepped aside, allowing them in, not out of kindness, but out of a detached curiosity. They sat stiffly at her small kitchen table, so different from the sprawling dining room they once presided over. Robert folded his hands together, his voice low. "We need your help. The press. The rumors. They won't stop." And if more comes out, Evelyn cut him off, her tone cool. "More will come out. That's what happens when lies unravel. You don't need my help to stop it. You need the truth, and that's something you've never been willing to face." Margaret flinched as though struck. "Please," she begged, leaning forward, her manicured hands clutching at the edge of the table. "Don't release anything else. Don't let anyone know more than they already do." Linda is suffering, and this family, we can't take another blow." Her voice cracked on the last word, desperation bleeding through her composure. Evelyn regarded her mother carefully, her face unreadable. "Do you remember," she asked quietly, "the night you told me I was no longer welcome, that I was a disgrace, a thief, a disappointment? Do you remember locking the door while I stood outside with nowhere to go?" Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Evelyn's gaze hardened. "I slept in bus stations and shelters. I washed dishes in diners until my fingers bled. All because you chose to believe Linda's lie, and now you sit in front of me begging for silence." Robert shifted uncomfortably, his eyes downcast. "We made mistakes," he murmured. "We believed the wrong child. But Evelyn, this scandal will destroy us completely. Think of your family name." Evelyn's laugh was short and bitter. "My family name. That name never protected me. It was a chain you used to bind me, and when it suited you, you cut me loose. I built my life without it. I built everything without you. Why would I protect it now?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, her voice rising with emotion. "Because you're our daughter." Evelyn's reply was sharp, almost cutting. "A daughter you turned into a servant. A daughter you discarded like trash. You don't get to claim me now, not when your empire of lies is burning down." She leaned forward, her tone steady and cold. "The truth doesn't need my permission to spread. It will speak for itself, and I won't stop it." Margaret sobbed into her hands, her composure finally shattered. Robert sat rigid, his jaw tight, but he said nothing, perhaps recognizing the futility of arguments. Evelyn watched them both, remembering nights huddled on concrete, the taste of cheap bread for dinner, the sting of being invisible while her sister's every whim was indulged. Those memories rose now like shadows, reminding her why she had vowed never to kneel again before their power. For the first time, Evelyn realized the reversal was complete. It was her parents who sat humbled, powerless, their voices pleading instead of commanding. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and she was no longer the wounded girl they once cast aside. She was the woman who held the truth, the woman who had endured, and the woman who would not bend. As they stood to leave, Margaret touched Evelyn's arm, her grip weak. "Please, Evelyn, if you have any mercy left, don't let this go further." Evelyn met her gaze, her eyes like steel. "Mercy," she said softly, "was something you never offered me. Now I let the truth decide." They left in silence, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed in the small apartment. Evelyn stood for a long moment, staring at the space they had occupied, the sound of her mother's weeping still lingering in her ears. Then she turned away, her jaw set. She was no longer a victim of their cruelty. She was the one holding the line, and she would not waver. Linda had never been the type to surrender gracefully. Even as the walls of scandal closed in, she clawed at every possible escape route, desperate to reclaim the control that had slipped so violently from her hands. After her parents' humiliating plea to Evelyn had failed, she doubled down on her own defense. The first strike was legal. She hired a team of high-priced attorneys' men in sharp suits who promised to restore her reputation and punish the guilty. Her claim was straightforward. Evelyn, out of jealousy, had orchestrated the release of the incriminating footage. Linda argued that her sister had long held a grudge, and that this was nothing more than a malicious vendetta. But beneath the polished rhetoric, the case crumbled. The lawyers quickly discovered the flaw. There was no evidence linking Evelyn directly to the leak. The video had spread too widely too quickly through anonymous accounts and shadowy channels. The digital trail had been wiped clean by the professionals Evelyn had quietly engaged. In court filings, Linda's accusations looked less like fact and more like desperation. Judges dismissed her early motions for lack of proof, and legal commentators on television treated her claims with thinly veiled amusement. Another chapter in the Harper saga, one anchor quipped. "It seems Linda Harper is trying to sue her way out of reality." When the legal path failed, Linda turned to her old weapon, public relations. She announced a press conference inviting major outlets with the promise of setting the record straight. The day of the event, she stood at a podium in a rented Manhattan hall, photographers flashing as she adjusted her designer suit. With trembling hands, she unfolded her prepared statement. Her words, rehearsed but brittle, echoed through the microphones. The footage you have all seen was taken out of context, maliciously edited and spread with the intent to destroy me and my family. I have been the victim of a campaign of lies. But the press was no longer under her spell. Instead of nodding in agreement, they pounced with questions that sliced through her flimsy defense. Who edited the footage? Why were you in that hotel room? Can you explain the financial records that surfaced last week? Linda faltered, her polished facade cracking with each inquiry. When she tried to pivot, her words grew tangled, her denial less convincing. Reporters smirked, some openly laughing when she claimed, "I am still a trusted name in public relations." Headlines the next morning were merciless Linda Harper's press conference, a masterclass in delusion and fallen PR. Queen fails to spin scandal. The humiliation deepened when her own clients turned against her publicly. One luxury retailer, once proud to showcase her firm's campaigns, issued a statement not just severing ties, but condemning her actions. "We place our trust in integrity," their CEO said, and Linda Harper has violated that trust beyond repair. Another former client, a fashion label whose success Linda had long boasted of, went even further. Their spokesperson appeared on live television and declared, "Our brand cannot be associated with deceit. We will not return to Harper PR under any circumstances." The blow of those rejections was devastating. For years, Linda had built her empire on cultivating relationships, on projecting an image of untouchable success. Now, those same allies dismantled her reputation piece by piece, discarding her with the same swiftness she had once discarded Evelyn. Each rejection was another stone added to her downfall, another reminder that power built on manipulation collapses when the truth is revealed. Linda fought back with social media posts claiming she was the target of envy, that her success had made her a victim of smear campaigns. But the comments below her statements told the real story. Strangers mocked her excuses. Former colleagues hinted at darker secrets, and even casual onlookers seemed to take pleasure in watching her unravel. "She's learning what it's like to live without spin," one viral comment read. "And it's not pretty." As the days stretched into weeks, Linda's fight became more frantic. She cycled through strategies, legal threats, teary confessions, angry denials, but each one only made her look weaker. The harder she tried to claw back her dignity, the more it slipped through her fingers. Reporters no longer introduced her as a PR mogul. They called her the disgraced bride, the embezzler under scrutiny, or simply Linda Harper, scandal-ridden and desperate. Evelyn, watching from afar, did not gloat openly. She didn't need to. The spectacle spoke for itself. Linda was sinking, and every attempt to swim only dragged her deeper. Evelyn understood what many in the crowd of spectators were beginning to feel. Justice was not always loud or swift. Sometimes it was slow, cruel, a steady unraveling that left the guilty exposed. By the end of the month, Linda's law team had quietly withdrawn, citing irreconcilable differences. Her office stood nearly empty, her employees scattered to competitors, her name now a stain no firm wanted near theirs. For the once celebrated Harper daughter, the fight was over, even if she refused to admit it. She had waged war against the truth, and the truth had devoured her. And through it all, the public watched with fascination, half appalled, half delighted, as Linda Harper proved the oldest lesson of all: the higher the climb built on lies, the harder the inevitable fall. The collapse of Linda's reputation had consumed the Harper family like wildfire, leaving them exposed, humiliated, and frantic. After the failed lawsuits and disastrous press conference, reporters had taken up permanent residence outside the Harper estate, hurling questions at every passing shadow. Margaret, once the unshakable matriarch who carried herself with pride at country club luncheons, began to falter under the constant scrutiny. Her health, already fragile beneath layers of denial and vanity, gave way one night when the relentless gossip and headlines finally overwhelmed her. She collapsed in the middle of their marble foyer, her cries echoing down the empty halls until Robert called for an ambulance. By dawn, Margaret was in a hospital bed, pale and trembling, her chest tight with stress-induced shock. It was Robert, the same father who once looked at Evelyn with disdain, who made the phone call he had never imagined making. His voice on the line was not commanding or cold, but broken, strained. "Evelyn," he said softly, his tone heavy with shame, "your mother's in the hospital. She can't take much more of this. I don't know what to do." For a moment, Evelyn simply listened, her silence cutting through the tremor in his voice. The father who had thrown her out, who had stood by while she was cast as the family's shame, now reached out to her, not as a patriarch, but as a desperate man. When Evelyn arrived at the hospital, the sight before her was a haunting contradiction. Margaret lay against the stark white sheets, her face drained of color, her body fragile in a way Evelyn had never seen. Tubes and monitors surrounded the woman who had once dictated every detail of her daughter's lives. For a fleeting moment, Evelyn's breath caught an old memory pressing against her chest. She remembered being a child, perhaps 6 years old, running to her mother after scraping her knee. Margaret had lifted her, then cradled her, gently whispering comfort into her ear. But the moment had been short-lived. Hours later, Evelyn recalled being pushed aside, her mother fussing over Linda, instead her embrace already forgotten. That single glimpse of tenderness had been buried under years of neglect and cruelty, yet it surfaced now unbidden as she looked at the weakened woman before her. Robert sat slumped in a chair near the bed, his eyes bloodshot. He stood when Evelyn entered, relief washing over his face. "You came," he whispered, as though her presence alone might heal the fractures that time had carved. Evelyn did not respond to his gratitude. Instead, she walked to the side of the bed, her eyes steady, her heart conflicted. Margaret stirred, opening her eyes, and when she saw Evelyn, a flicker of something, shame, regret, or perhaps fear, crossed her face. The nurse came in with a clipboard listing the costs of Margaret's care. Robert looked at the figures with helpless eyes, murmuring that insurance would not cover it all, that bills were already mounting. Evelyn listened quietly, then pulled out her card and handed it over without hesitation. "I'll cover the expenses," she said. Robert blinked in shock. Margaret opened her mouth as if to protest, but Evelyn's voice silenced them both. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, not because you've earned it. Responsibility, not reconciliation." The words hung heavy in the sterile air. For the first time, Margaret seemed truly broken, not just by scandal, but by the realization that her daughter, the one she had discarded, was the only one holding her up now. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her voice weak. "Why would you help me after everything?" Evelyn did not soften. "Because I know what it means to be left with nothing. I lived that because of you. I won't let myself become what you were to me. That doesn't mean I forgive. It just means I remember." Robert lowered his gaze, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. The room filled with the hum of machines, the soft rhythm of Margaret's shallow breathing, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted forever. Evelyn was no longer the child pleading for love or the servant forced into silence. She was the one in control, the one who chose when and how to extend her hand. As she left the hospital that night, the city lights reflecting against her windshield, Evelyn's mind lingered on the image of her mother's frail form. There was pity there, yes, but not enough to erase the years of pain. That memory of being held and then pushed away returned again, sharper this time, a reminder that love had always been conditional in her family. She would not repeat that cycle, but she would not forget it either. For the audience who followed her story, the moment was bittersweet. Evelyn's act of covering the medical bills revealed not weakness, but strength, the strength to rise above vengeance without surrendering her dignity. She had shown compassion without erasing truth, responsibility, without granting absolution. Viewers would see her not only as a woman who fought for justice, but as one whose humanity endured despite every betrayal. And in that quiet balance of mercy and distance, Evelyn proved once more that she was no longer a victim. She was the one writing the story now. The ride home from the hospital was long, quiet, and heavy with thought. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road, but her mind drifted back to the pale figure lying against white sheets, the fragile version of her mother that she had never known existed. She had paid the bills, spoken the words that made her stance clear, but the echo of her own voice lingered responsibility, not forgiveness. That distinction haunted her as much as it steadied her. Alone again in her apartment, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at her desk, the city lights flickering against the window pane. The question rose unbidden, cutting through the quiet. Has all of this, every revelation, every humiliation I've let them taste, made me happy? Or has it only left me hollow? For years she had imagined moments like these where her parents would kneel, where Linda's empire would burn, where the family that had discarded her would suffer the consequences of their cruelty. And yet, sitting in the silence of her own hard-won success, Evelyn found the satisfaction less potent than she had expected. Justice had been served, yes, but happiness. That was a more complicated matter. Revenge had given her power, but it had not filled the void that had been carved by years of neglect. The scars remained, and no amount of public disgrace for the Harpers could erase them. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down an old leather-bound album she had not opened in years. Dust clung to the cover, a reminder of how deeply she had buried it. She flipped through the pages, her eyes landing on photos from childhood birthdays, where Linda smiled in new dresses while Evelyn wore hand-me-downs Christmas mornings with piles of gifts for one daughter and token trinkets for the other. And then nestled between the pages a family portrait she had tried to forget. Her mother stood tall in the center, her arm draped proudly around Linda, while Evelyn lingered at the edge, almost cropped out by the frame. She stared at the picture for a long time, her throat tight. That girl in the photograph had once prayed for her mother's embrace, once longed for a father's acknowledgement, once begged for a sister's companionship. She had received none of it, and yet she had survived, had risen, had created a life beyond what any of them imagined. The Evelyn in the photo was invisible. The Evelyn now was undeniable. With deliberate movements, she tore the photograph into pieces, the sound of ripping paper echoing in the quiet apartment. She scattered the fragments across her desk, watching the pieces flutter like fallen leaves. Then carefully she picked up one scrap, the one with her mother's face. She held it between her fingers, her gaze fixed on the woman who had both raised and destroyed her. For reasons she could not entirely name, she set that fragment aside instead of discarding it. Perhaps it was weakness, or perhaps it was acknowledgement that some ties, no matter how damaged, never fully sever. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her eyes on that single piece of paper. She whispered aloud, not to her mother, not even to herself, but to the quiet air, I won't destroy you completely. I won't become you. The words surprised her, but they felt true. She had the power to keep unraveling every thread of the Harper family, to expose more secrets, to ensure their ruin was absolute. But what would that make her? A mirror of the cruelty she had endured, a reflection of the same hunger for dominance that had poisoned them. No, she would not carry that legacy. Instead, Evelyn resolved to shift her focus. Her energy, her brilliance, her drive, they belonged not to the past, but to the future she was building. Her company was thriving, her employees loyal, her reputation untouchable. She had a life of her own, one defined not by the Harpers, but by her choices. And that was the true victory. Revenge had been necessary, perhaps even inevitable, but it was not where her story would end. She gathered the scraps of the photo into an envelope, sealing them away. The piece with her mother's face she slipped into a drawer, hidden but not destroyed. It was a reminder both of pain endured and of the choice she had made to rise without obliterating, to cut ties without cutting away her own humanity. For Evelyn, that balance mattered. As she turned off the lights and walked toward her bedroom, Evelyn felt a calm she had not known in years. Not joy, not triumph, but a quiet steadiness. She no longer needed to prove herself through their downfall. Their destruction had been inevitable, fueled by their own arrogance and deceit. What mattered now was the life she had fought for, the freedom she had carved, and the dignity she refused to relinquish. For those watching her story unfold, this moment was not one of fire or spectacle, but of depth. It was the scene where the woman once cast as a servant chose not just victory, but growth. It was the reminder that revenge can satisfy, but only self-respect can heal. Evelyn's decision not to destroy her family completely was not weakness, it was strength, the kind that drew admiration from all who had followed her journey. She was not a reflection of their cruelty. She was proof that survival could blossom into something greater. After sealing the fragments of her family photograph away, Evelyn felt the clarity of her choice settle into her bones. Revenge had served its purpose, but she would not let it define the rest of her days. The silence of her apartment that night seemed less oppressive, almost like an invitation to imagine what her life could be if she allowed herself to live without looking back. Within weeks, she took a step that symbolized her rebirth. She purchased a penthouse in Manhattan, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened to the skyline she had once only admired from afar. The city stretched out beneath her like a canvas, every light a reminder that she had built this life on her own terms. The penthouse became more than a home. It was a declaration. Every room reflected her independence. She filled it with art, she loved books she had never had time to read, and warm touches that gave the space life. On a quiet afternoon, she brought home a golden retriever puppy, his tail wagging furiously as he tumbled across the hardwood floors. She named him Atlas, a symbol of the weight she had carried and the strength she had found to set it down. Atlas followed her everywhere, a constant companion in the space that no longer echoed with loneliness. For the first time in decades, Evelyn allowed herself hobbies that had nothing to do with survival or ambition. She signed up for a painting class at a small studio downtown, walking into the room with a blank canvas and leaving with strokes of color that surprised even her. She was not an artist, but she did not need to be. The act itself, the brush moving across paper without expectation, felt liberating. It was creation without judgment, a luxury she had never permitted herself before. The instructor, a cheerful woman in her 60s, encouraged her warmly, telling her that every painting was a reflection of courage. Evelyn smiled at that, thinking how courage had shaped her more than talent ever could. Her presence in the city's philanthropic circles grew naturally. She attended charity galas not as a guest hiding in shadows, but as a recognized name in her own right. At one such event for children's education, she was invited to the stage and introduced as a benefactor who had quietly supported several initiatives for years. The applause that followed startled her at first, but as she stood there, she realized she belonged. Reporters later praised her not just for her success in business, but for her generosity, writing that Evelyn Harper had redefined what it meant to rise from adversity. Still, the past had its way of whispering through even the brightest moments. At one gala, as she clinked glasses with fellow philanthropists, a longtime friend approached her. Marianne, a woman Evelyn had known since college, pulled her aside with a gentle smile. "You've built something extraordinary," Marianne said. "But don't let resentment weigh you down. Forgiveness when you're ready can be as powerful as success." The words landed with both comfort and unease. Evelyn knew Marianne spoke from kindness, yet the suggestion stirred conflict within her. Forgiveness. The word carried a weight she was not ready to lift. Images of her mother pushing her away, of Linda smirking as she signed the forged documents, of nights shivering in shelters, all resurfaced at once. She nodded politely to Marianne, offering a faint smile, but inside she bristled. Not yet, she thought. Perhaps not ever. That evening, back in her penthouse, she stood by the window with Atlas curled at her feet. The city pulsed with energy below, oblivious to her thoughts. She traced her finger along the glass, whispering to herself, "Forgiveness is not the same as freedom. I've already chosen freedom." The conviction steadied her, though she wondered if Marianne might be right, that carrying the past even as a burden of defiance was still carrying it. In those quiet nights, Evelyn found a rhythm of peace she had never known. She walked Atlas through Central Park, laughed with strangers in her painting class, and felt the slow return of something resembling joy. But beneath the calm, a part of her remained alert, waiting, aware that storms rarely ended so neatly. The Harper name was still fractured, Linda still desperate, and her parents still lingering in the shadows of shame. Evelyn knew that peace could be temporary, a fragile reprieve before the next confrontation. For those who followed her journey, this chapter revealed a different kind of drama, not the chaos of scandal, but the delicate balance of healing and vigilance. Evelyn was no longer fighting to prove herself, yet she remained cautious, her triumph tempered by the knowledge that unresolved tensions had a way of resurfacing. The sight of her with a puppy in her arms, a brush in her hand, or a microphone at a charity gala painted a portrait of growth, but it also hinted at fragility, the calm before another storm. And so Evelyn's story paused on a note of quiet dignity. She had carved out a new home, a new life filled with moments of peace and glimpses of joy. Yet the audience watching her tale unfold knew instinctively that such tranquility was never the final act. It was the eye of the hurricane, and sooner or later the winds would rise again. The calm of Evelyn's new life was steadying her like a fragile balance she dared not disturb. She had begun to trust the silence in her penthouse, the routine of painting classes, the loyalty of Atlas by her side. Then one autumn afternoon, as the city's skyline glowed orange with the fading sun, a thick envelope arrived at her door. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, her father's. It had been years since she'd seen his penmanship, sharp and slanted, the kind that once signed school permission slips and business contracts with the same indifference. Her chest tightened as she slid her finger beneath the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages written in a tone she had rarely known from him. It began with words she had longed to hear as a child, an apology. He confessed his failures as a father, admitted to watching silently while Margaret's cruelty went unchecked, and acknowledged that he had allowed Linda's lies to drive Evelyn from their home. He wrote of his shame of nights where he thought of her but lacked the courage to reach out, of moments when her absence was felt like a ghost in their family gatherings. Evelyn's eyes blurred as she read. It was the closest he had ever come to speaking the truth. But as she turned the page, the tone shifted. Buried within the contrition was a revelation that stripped the comfort from his words. He explained that years ago he had created a fund, a secret reserve of $300,000. That money, he wrote, had been meant exclusively for Linda. The reasoning was as blunt as it was cruel. Linda needs more than you do. She is the face of the family. Her reputation, her image, it demands support. You have always been resourceful, Evelyn. Linda has always needed help to shine. Evelyn's hands trembled as she set the letter down. The words stared back at her like a fresh wound. It was not that she had expected fairness, not anymore, but the confirmation in her father's own script that even in his apology he clung to favoritism cut deeply. His plea for forgiveness was poisoned by proof that his blindness had never lifted. He could see his mistakes, but he could not unlearn them. He still viewed her strength as justification for neglect, and Linda's fragility as reason for endless indulgence. She rose from her chair, pacing the length of her living room, the letter clutched in her fist. Atlas padded behind her, sensing the agitation in her movements. She felt anger boiling beneath her ribs, but it was laced with a hollow ache. She thought of the nights she had slept in shelters, the hunger that gnawed at her when she could barely afford food, the humiliation of starting from nothing while her family lived in comfort. $300,000 hidden away, not for survival, not for fairness, but to maintain Linda's illusion of grandeur. How many doors could that sum have opened for Evelyn when she was 18, cold and alone? How many nights of despair might it have spared her? And yet even as the fury surged, she realized she was not surprised. She had spent her entire life learning that Linda's needs would always outweigh her own in her parents' eyes. This letter did not rewrite her history. It confirmed it. The apology, heartfelt as it might have been, was tangled in the same pattern that had defined her family, Evelyn, as the strong one who needed nothing, Linda, as the fragile jewel who required protection at all costs. She returned to her desk and read the closing lines again. Her father begged her not to reveal the existence of the fund, pleaded for her understanding, promised that this time truly he saw her. But the words rang hollow against the admission that he still valued Linda's reputation over Evelyn's dignity. Her lips curled into a bitter smile as she folded the pages carefully and slid them back into the envelope. Sitting in the quiet glow of her apartment, Evelyn whispered aloud, "So even in the end, you still chose her." There was no venom in her tone, only resignation. She realized then that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not come from their words. It would come from her choice to live beyond them, to let their favoritism no longer define her. For the audience who followed her story, the letter was another strike of injustice, a reminder that wounds inflicted in childhood linger even in adulthood. It deepened the anger they felt toward the Harper family, stirring outrage that even a father's apology was compromised by bias. Yet it also underscored Evelyn's strength. She did not tear the letter in rage, nor did she cling to it in desperate hope. She simply placed it in a drawer, a record of truth she would never deny, but one she would not allow to chain her future. As she looked out at the Manhattan skyline once more, the letter tucked away, Evelyn felt the familiar ache of betrayal settle like a shadow at her side. But alongside it was clarity she had survived worse than this. No secret fund, no belated confession could undo the empire she had built, or the independence she had carved. Her father's words might sting, but they no longer had the power to define her. The unfairness of his legacy was his burden to bear, not hers. The envelope with her father's letter still rested in Evelyn's drawer when the call came that shattered the fragile balance of her new life. Robert Harper, the man who had pleaded with her for forgiveness yet still clung to favoritism, was gone. A sudden heart attack had taken him in the middle of the night. Evelyn listened to the news in silence, her hand resting on Atlas's head, as the voice on the line explained the details. There was no time for last words, no chance for reconciliation beyond the hollow apologies in ink. The finality settled over her like a heavy coat, both suffocating and strangely clarifying. Whatever unresolved questions she carried would remain so forever. The funeral was set quickly, befitting the Harper family's reputation. The old estate, once a symbol of pride, was now cloaked in black drapery and solemn faces. Evelyn arrived in understated elegance, her presence noted by every eye in the room. Some whispered about her success, others about the scandals that had torn the family apart, but all eyes shifted uneasily when she walked through the doors. For years she had been invisible at such gatherings. Now her very existence was a silent rebuke. Margaret sat at the front, veiled and rigid, her grief sharp and raw. Linda, immaculate as always, played the role of dutiful daughter, her hand gripping their mother's as if possession could rewrite history. Evelyn took her place quietly, offering no comfort and asking for none. She had come not for spectacle, but to bear witness to the end of the man who had both abandoned and acknowledged her in the same breath. After the eulogies and the hymns, the air shifted as the family lawyer stood carrying a leather folder. He cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the chapel. As per the wishes of the deceased, the last will and testament of Robert Harper will now be read. Silence swept the room, broken only by the faint rustle of fabric as guests leaned in. Evelyn's heart was steady, though she braced herself. She had read his letter. She knew the pattern. And yet a part of her still hoped for justice. The lawyer's words cut that hope clean. I, Robert Harper, being of sound mind and body, hereby leave the entirety of my estate, including all assets, holdings, and investments, to my daughter, Linda Harper. A gasp rippled through the pews. Evelyn sat still, her face an unmoving mask, but the whispers erupted like wildfire. Everything to Linda, someone murmured. That can't be right, another hissed. Near the back, an elderly aunt shook her head, her voice carrying louder than she intended. Evelyn deserves more than anyone. She's the one who made something of herself." The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the lawyer's formal decree. Linda straightened in her seat, chin lifted with triumph, though her eyes flicked nervously toward her sister. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. Evelyn rose slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She felt the stares of every guest pressing into her, waiting for a reaction, a scene, an outburst. But she gave them nothing. Her eyes, sharp and clear, met the lawyer's for a moment, then her mother's, and finally Linda's. In that gaze was no plea, no defeat, only resolve. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the stone floor, each step measured and sure. Outside, the crisp air hit her face, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of injustice settle, and then slide away. The will was yet another insult, another confirmation that no matter what she achieved, her family's loyalties had never been hers to claim. But she was no longer the young girl cast out into the cold. She was the woman who had built her own empire, her own life, without their name, their money, or their approval. Guests filtered out behind her, their whispers chasing her into the sunlight. She caught fragments, admiration, pity, outrage. Some shook their heads at the unfairness, others marveled at her composure. Evelyn walked past them all, her gaze fixed ahead, unflinching. Her strength was no longer in their validation or their inheritance. It was in her refusal to be broken by yet another betrayal. For those watching her journey unfold, this moment marked a second climax, a cruel twist of fate that threatened to reopen old wounds. Yet instead of crumbling, Evelyn's resolve became clearer. She had faced the pinnacle of familial injustice, disinherited, dismissed, erased, even in death. And still, she stood taller than the family that tried to bury her worth. As she stepped into her car, Atlas waiting patiently inside, Evelyn allowed herself a faint smile. The Harper legacy might have written her out, but her own legacy was still being written louder, brighter, and far more enduring than any fortune left behind. The air after the funeral was sharp and heavy, the kind that clung to Evelyn's skin long after she left the Harper estate. She carried no bitterness on her face, but inside the injustice of the will weighed like a final insult carved into stone, her father's words in his letter. His final decision at the reading, every slight that had defined her place in the family, it all seemed to echo louder now. That night, as she sat in her Manhattan penthouse with Atlas resting at her feet, she opened her laptop and stared at the blank screen. For years, she had endured their narrative in silence, allowed their lies to shape how others perceived her. But silence was no longer strength. It was time for the truth. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she began to type. The words flowed not like a confession, but like a release. She wrote about being 18 and accused of stealing money she never touched, about how her sister forged her name to save herself. She described being cast out, branded a traitor by her parents, left to wander the streets with nothing but shame stitched into her skin. She wrote of nights spent working 2 jobs just to buy food, of the loneliness that shadowed her when she built herself from scratch. She did not seek pity, only understanding. She explained that she had built Grand Muse events from the ground up without a cent from the Harper family, that every accolade she earned had come from sweat and persistence, not from inherited wealth or family connections. She did not embellish or dramatize. The raw truth was powerful enough. She ended the post with a line that resonated like a bell. "They erased me from their story, but I wrote my own." When she pressed publish, the screen blinked and the world shifted. Within minutes, notifications poured in, messages, comments, shares. Old friends reached out with words of support. Strangers expressed admiration, and colleagues praised her courage. The story spread far beyond LinkedIn, picked up by media outlets eager to frame it as the tale of a woman rising from betrayal to triumph. Evelyn did not read every word, but she felt the ripple of her truth moving through circles that had once whispered only the Harper family's version. The impact was immediate within her own bloodline. Relatives who had long accepted Linda's shining image and Evelyn's supposed failures began emailing, sending letters. They admitted they had believed the lies, that they had looked away when they should have questioned. A cousin confessed he remembered the day of the theft accusation, but never spoke up, fearing Margaret's wrath. An uncle wrote that he admired her resilience and regretted the years lost to silence. The apologies were late, but they were real, and Evelyn received them with a calm dignity. She did not need their approval, but their acknowledgement was proof that truth once spoken could not be buried again. Meanwhile, Linda's world narrowed. When the LinkedIn post went viral, she vanished from social gatherings, her name spoken only in hushed tones. At one charity event Evelyn attended weeks later, someone whispered Linda didn't dare show her face after her sister told the world. Evelyn did not gloat, but she noticed. The once proud figure who had flaunted her role as the family jewel had slipped into shadows, unwilling to face the truth Evelyn had set free. Evelyn encountered Margaret only once in that period. Her mother's eyes were hollow, her shoulders smaller somehow, as if the weight of public shame had finally pressed down. She said nothing, not even a word of defense. Evelyn simply met her gaze and moved past. The silence between them was no longer a void, it was Evelyn's freedom. For those who had followed her journey, this revelation was more than a personal victory. It was a reckoning. The child who had been silenced, erased, and exiled had risen to tell her own story, and in doing so, stripped away the illusions the Harpers had built. The drama was not in the shouting matches or the confrontations, but in the quiet power of a woman claiming her truth, in a world that had once refused to hear it. Evelyn closed her laptop one evening weeks later, the city glittering beyond her windows, and realized she no longer carried the same burden. The lies had been heavy, but the truth was light even if it came late. Justice, she understood, did not always look like punishment. Sometimes it was as simple as being heard, as undeniable as honesty laid bare. The post that Evelyn had shared on LinkedIn continued to ripple outward, its impact extending far beyond what she had anticipated. Reporters quoted it, magazines dissected it, and strangers sent her messages of gratitude, sharing their own stories of being silenced and underestimated. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn found herself standing not only as the head of Grand Muse events, but as a symbol of resilience. When Forbes released their annual list, her name was not only included, but highlighted Evelyn Harper, Female Entrepreneur of the Year. The article praised her vision, her perseverance, and her refusal to bow to the weight of family rejection. For Evelyn, the recognition was more than a title. It was proof that she had rewritten the story they once tried to erase. Soon after, she received an invitation to appear on a nationally televised talk show, one known for celebrating stories of triumph. Walking onto that stage beneath the bright lights and in front of a live audience, Evelyn carried herself with quiet authority. The host, a woman whose interviews had moved millions, leaned forward with genuine admiration as she asked, "How does it feel to stand here today, knowing everything you've overcome?" Evelyn spoke carefully, sharing glimpses of her journey without descending into bitterness. She emphasized the importance of self-belief, of building success not for validation, but for survival and dignity. The audience erupted into applause, many on their feet. In that moment, Evelyn felt the past finally loosen its grip. She was no longer the family's invisible child. She was the woman the world celebrated. It was after that appearance, when her story had reached its widest audience yet, that Linda reemerged. A message arrived through Evelyn's assistant, framed in careful words. Linda praised Evelyn's growth, admired her recognition, and then pivoted quickly to business. She proposed a collaboration. Her public relations firm would represent Grand Muse events, guiding its expanding brand into new markets. The tone was professional, but Evelyn recognized the desperation woven through every line. Linda's own reputation was in ruins, clients had walked away, and opportunities had evaporated. She needed her sister's success to survive. For a long moment, Evelyn simply stared at the proposal. There was irony in it, almost comical in its audacity. Years ago, Linda had mocked her as nothing more than a servant, someone incapable of grasping ambition. Now, Linda sought to attach herself to the very empire Evelyn had built from scratch. The contrast was almost too sharp to be believed. She thought of the audiences who had cheered her on television, the article that called her one of the most powerful women in business, and then of the sister who once delighted in seeing her humiliated. When she finally responded, Evelyn's words were clear and unyielding. She thanked Linda for the offer, but made it unmistakable that Grand Muse had no need for her services. "My company does not require your help," she wrote. The rejection was polite on the surface, but carried the full weight of her authority. It was not spoken in anger, but in certainty. The message struck with finality. For Evelyn, it was not just about denying Linda's proposal. It was about affirming the boundaries she had built, boundaries that would never again be crossed. She had no obligation to offer her sister a lifeline, not when that sister had once taken delight in pushing her underwater. The drama of it resonated powerfully, the sheer contrast between Evelyn's soaring recognition and Linda's dwindling relevance. In private, Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. She did not need revenge delivered with spectacle. Sometimes the quiet power of saying no was enough. Linda's desperation was evident, and Evelyn's refusal cut deeper than any public humiliation could. The world was watching Evelyn rise while Linda, once the favored daughter, was left scrambling for survival. The audience who followed Evelyn's journey would see this as another twist, one that deepened the sense of justice. Evelyn's victories were no longer just personal, they were symbolic. Each recognition, each award, each refusal to bend to family manipulation painted a sharper picture of her strength. Linda's decline, juxtaposed with Evelyn's ascent, highlighted the inevitable truth: favoritism and deceit could never outlast perseverance and dignity. The rejection from Evelyn had landed like a stone on Linda's already fractured career. After years of enjoying the spotlight as the family's jewel, she found herself drifting through shadows, her phone silent, her email inbox void of opportunities. Scandals clung to her name like a stain that no amount of polish could remove. One by one, doors slammed in her face. Former colleagues avoided her, potential employers searched her name and quickly moved on, and even distant acquaintances hesitated to be seen with her. For someone who had once thrived on appearances, the silence was suffocating. Linda began applying everywhere she could, from boutique firms to larger agencies, each time trying to frame her downfall as a temporary setback. But the responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections. Most didn't bother to reply. The whispers about her betrayal, the viral clip from her wedding, and the reports of mismanagement at her firm had poisoned her reputation beyond repair. She scrolled through job boards late into the night, her manicured nails tapping nervously on the keyboard, but even junior positions remained out of reach. The proud image she had once projected was gone, replaced by desperation. In her darkest moments, Linda considered giving up entirely, retreating into obscurity. But desperation often breeds audacity. One evening, staring at her dwindling bank account and the unpaid bills stacking on her desk, she made a choice. She would shed her old name, the one that now carried nothing but disgrace. She filled out applications under the alias Laura Hart, crafting a new identity with a resume that highlighted her skills while omitting the scandals. It was a gamble, but she was cornered enough to take it. Among the companies she targeted was one whose name she had heard whispered with growing frequency: Grand Muse Events. Its reputation was impeccable, its client list dazzling. Linda did not realize, perhaps blinded by desperation, perhaps willfully ignoring the possibility that this empire belonged to the sister she had once scorned. To her, Grand Muse represented a chance at legitimacy, a place where her tarnished past would remain hidden under her fabricated name. When Evelyn's assistant received the application from Laura Hart, it was processed like any other. But when the file landed on Evelyn's desk, she froze. The resume, though cleverly altered, carried too many familiar notes: the cadence of the writing, the phrasing of past accomplishments, the faint outlines of Linda's former life, painted over, but not erased. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she read. She recognized her sister's ambition even beneath the mask. Linda had applied to Grand Muse unaware she was walking straight into Evelyn's domain. For a long moment, Evelyn considered dismissing the application outright. It would have been easy, a small act of control, to erase Linda from her world once more. But as she sat back in her chair, the faintest smile tugged at her lips. There was something more powerful in letting this play out. Instead of denying Linda entry, she instructed her assistant to schedule an interview. The decision was not rooted in cruelty, but in clarity. Evelyn understood the drama of the moment that was about to unfold. The audience of her life, those who had followed her through betrayal, survival, and triumph, would sense the same tension, the inevitability of confrontation. For years, Linda had avoided facing her sister's strength. Now, disguised under a false name, she was unknowingly walking straight into Evelyn's office. Evelyn imagined the scene the moment Linda would sit across from her, expecting to charm her way into a new opportunity, only to realize she had been sitting before the very person she once demeaned. The irony was exquisite. She thought back to the countless times Linda had dismissed her, the way her parents had sided with their younger daughter, the humiliations she had endured in silence. Now the tables had turned in a way almost too poetic to script. As the interview date was set, Evelyn said nothing to her staff. To them, Laura Hart was simply another candidate. Only Evelyn knew the truth, and she guarded it with a calculated calm. The anticipation built within her not as anger, but as resolve. This was not about vengeance in its most violent form. It was about control, about showing Linda what it meant to stand in the position of power she had once denied Evelyn. The drama of it was undeniable. Viewers of Evelyn's story would feel the suspense, the thrill of watching a carefully constructed trap close in. Linda's desperation had driven her into the lion's den, and Evelyn, now the lion, was prepared to receive her. The irony was not lost on Evelyn, and she let herself savor it. The meeting was set, the stage prepared, and soon sister would face sister not as equals, but as employer and applicant, judge and judged. The day of the interview arrived with a peculiar stillness, as though the city itself paused to witness the meeting that was about to unfold. Evelyn prepared her office meticulously, not because she needed to impress, but because she wanted the stage to be worthy of the moment. The floor-to-ceiling windows cast long streams of light across her desk, the skyline of Manhattan gleaming behind her like a crown. This was her kingdom, built by her hands, untouched by family favoritism. Now into this space, Linda would walk, though she believed she was Laura Hart. When the assistant announced the candidate's arrival, Evelyn allowed herself a single steadying breath. She rose to greet her, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The door opened and Linda stepped inside. Her appearance was polished but strained, a carefully constructed mask that could not conceal the fatigue in her eyes. She extended a hand and introduced herself as Laura Hart, her voice steady, though her gaze flickered with nervousness. Evelyn shook the hand without hesitation, her grip firm, her eyes studying every detail of her sister's face. The interview began like any other. Evelyn asked about experience, leadership style, and adaptability under pressure. Linda answered with practiced ease, weaving tales of past successes that skirted the truth. Evelyn listened with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment. She asked follow-up questions, subtle ones designed to push Linda into corners, and observed how her sister maneuvered to escape them. It was a dance of words, one Evelyn controlled effortlessly. As the minutes stretched, Linda began to relax, convinced she was winning the room. She leaned forward, her tone turning almost persuasive, as if trying to charm her way into opportunity. She spoke of her ability to handle high-profile clients, of her skill in crisis management, her confidence swelling with each word. Evelyn nodded politely, offering no indication of the storm building beneath her composed surface. Finally, Evelyn closed the folder in front of her, leaned back in her chair, and let silence fill the room. Linda shifted her smile, faltering. Evelyn's eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. Then, with a calm voice edged with steel, she spoke the words that shattered the illusion. "You think I wouldn't recognize you, Linda?" The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Linda froze her face, draining of color, her lips parting in shock. The persona of Laura Hart crumbled instantly, replaced by raw panic. She stammered, unable to form a defense. Evelyn didn't move, didn't flinch, simply let the truth hang heavy between them. I've watched you lie for years. Evelyn continued, her voice, even each word deliberate. Lie to our parents, to your clients, to me. But here you are in my office begging under a false name. Tears welled in Linda's eyes. She dropped the pretense entirely, her shoulders slumping as desperation took over. Please, Evelyn, she whispered, her voice cracking. I need this. You don't understand. I have nothing left. Just give me a chance. For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. She studied her sister, the once proud woman, reduced to pleading in the very space she had once deemed Evelyn unworthy of occupying. Then Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes sharp. A chance, she repeated. After everything you've taken, after every time you laughed while they pushed me down. No, Linda. You don't get a chance at the top. Linda clasped her hands together, her voice trembling. I'll do anything. I'll work harder than anyone. Please, I can't survive like this. Evelyn let the silence stretch before delivering the verdict. I will offer you one position, she said finally. Assistant. Entry level. A role where you fetch coffee file papers and learn humility. She let the words sink in her tone, cold but not cruel. This is where you belong, not on the mountaintop you thought was yours by birthright, but at the bottom where you earn every step. Linda's tears spilled freely now. Her face twisted with humiliation. She nodded weakly, unable to argue, stripped of pride. Evelyn did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply closed the file, stood, and extended her hand once more. Decide if you can accept it. That's the only offer you'll get. The drama of the moment was palpable, a quiet retribution far sharper than any public scandal. Evelyn had not screamed, had not sought to destroy. She had simply held a mirror to her sister, showing her the reality she had earned. For the audience who followed Evelyn's journey, it was a moment of exquisite justice, measured precise and undeniably human. The night of the 10th anniversary celebration of Grand Muse Events was unlike any other. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, crystal chandeliers casting a glow that reflected off polished marble floors. Guests in elegant gowns and tailored suits mingled glasses of champagne in hand. Their conversations a hum of admiration for the company Evelyn had built from nothing. The room was filled not only with clients and partners, but also with employees who had stood beside her through the years, people who believed in her vision when no one else did. The celebration was more than an event. It was a declaration that Grand Muse was not just surviving, but thriving, a testament to resilience and grit. Evelyn stood near the center of it all, dressed in a sleek gown of midnight blue that mirrored the night sky beyond the windows. Her presence radiated quiet authority, every gesture deliberate, every word spoken with poise. She had addressed countless crowds over the years, but tonight carried a special weight. It marked not only the company's success, but her own liberation from the chains of the past. As the evening reached its peak, the music softened, and the clinking of glasses fell silent. All eyes turned to Evelyn as she stepped onto the small stage, a champagne flute in her hand. She looked out across the sea of faces, her employees smiling with pride, her partners nodding with respect, and her heart swelled with something she had rarely allowed herself to feel: peace. She raised her glass, her voice steady, carrying through the hall. I am no longer a servant. I am a CEO, and I live true to my values. The words rang out like a vow, one that resonated deeply with everyone who had followed her story, whether in that room or beyond. The applause was immediate and thunderous, filling the space with energy. Yet in the corner, nearly hidden among the staff, clearing plates and replenishing glasses, stood Linda. Her uniform, plain and unremarkable, was a sharp contrast to the elegance that filled the room. Her posture slumped. Her eyes cast downward, she moved silently with a tray balanced in her hands. She avoided Evelyn's gaze, as though unable to face the sister she had once sought to overshadow. The reversal was stark. Years ago, Evelyn had been the one forced into servitude, invisible among guests. Now Linda wore that role humbled by her fall, her pride stripped away. Evelyn noticed her, of course. She always did. For a brief moment their eyes nearly met, and a flood of old memories threatened to rise. The laughter at Evelyn's expense, the forged signature, the cold dismissals from their parents, all the betrayals that had once defined Evelyn's life. But tonight, none of it mattered. Evelyn did not need vengeance, nor did she feel pity. She felt something greater release. Turning back to the hall, she let her gaze drift to the towering windows where the New York skyline glittered against the night. Beyond the glass, the city pulsed with life, its lights a reflection of her journey, each one a victory hard won, each one a reminder of how far she had come. She smiled a quiet, unshakable smile that belonged not to the servant her family once tried to mold, but to the woman she had become. In that moment, Evelyn knew with certainty that she was free. The applause swelled again as her words settled into the hearts of those present. Employees cheered, clients raised their glasses, and the air buzzed with admiration. What they saw was not just a businesswoman, but a survivor who had turned betrayal into strength, who had built not only a company, but a life on her own terms. The celebration was grand, but the true victory lay in the boundaries Evelyn had drawn, the respect she had demanded, and the dignity she had reclaimed. As the evening carried on, Evelyn moved through the room greeting guests and sharing laughter while Linda faded further into the background, her presence a quiet reminder of the cost of cruelty and arrogance. For Evelyn, there was no satisfaction in Linda's humiliation, only the knowledge that the cycle had ended. The roles had reversed, but Evelyn was no longer trapped by comparison. She was not defined by her sister's failures or her parents' favoritism. She was defined by her own choices, her own triumphs, her own truth. Later that night, when the last toast had been made and the music played softly into the early hours, Evelyn returned to the window once more. She looked out at the city, the vast expanse of lights stretching endlessly, and felt a profound calm settle over her. The girl who had been erased from her family's story had written her own, and it was brighter than she could have ever imagined. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I am free." And that was Evelyn's journey from a girl stripped of her dignity at her sister's wedding to the woman who raised her glass as CEO, owning every step of her life. Her story wasn't just about revenge. It was about breaking free from chains that others tried to lock around her, about proving that no one decides your worth but you. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been treated as invisible in your own family, only to find your strength later? Did you ever feel like the underdog who finally stood tall? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your story might just give courage to someone else who needs it. If this story kept you watching, if you felt the anger, the twists, and that final moment of justice, then make sure to subscribe. We bring you real stories of betrayal drama and unexpected triumph stories where justice is served even if it takes years. Remember, you are not here to be small. You are here to stand tall, to know your worth, and to never let anyone write your story for you.